Japanese History Chapter 1 Ancient Period Jomon Yayoi Kofun 1. Jomon Culture. The first Japanese probably crossed land bridges that connected Korea with Kyushu. When sea levels rose, those land bridges disappeared. The people who stayed in the Japanese islands lived by hunting and gathering things to eat. They hunted deer and boars. They gathered seeds, plants, fish, and shellfish. We know what they ate because they left behind shell middens, kaizuka. Archaeologists learn about these people by examining these middens. These people also made perhaps the earliest pottery in the world. The name Jomon refers to the rope pattern on the surface of their ceramics. They began making this pottery around 12,000 BC in various parts of Japan. Some of these ceramic works are highly decorative and surprisingly modern. Because the pottery is so distinctive, we call the period from circa 10,000 BC to 300 BC the Jomon period. One of the best places to learn about Jomon culture is the Sanai Maruyama site in Aomori Prefecture. Researchers found pit dwellings, long houses, and large pillar-supported structures. They also found stone tools, clay figures, and woven bags. Jomon people probably lived there until about 4,000 years ago. The outdoor museum there shows what Jomon life was probably like. 2. Yayoi culture. In about 400 BC, several major influences came from the Yangtze Basin of China through the Korean peninsula. The first influence was the introduction of rice cultivation. Archaeological sites in western Japan have stone tools and grains of rice. This suggests that techniques for growing rice in paddies came through Korea. Rice agriculture rapidly spread eastward. In most areas, rice farming did not immediately replace hunting and gathering as a way of living. The new culture coexisted with Jomon culture. The work of growing rice required more cooperation. People settled in one place and developed communities. Small farming communities grew into small kingdoms. These small kingdoms then joined into groups for self-protection. As time passed, the earlier culture of hunting and gathering declined. The second influence was the introduction of techniques for making iron and bronze. Through trade and immigration, the people of the Yayoi period gained iron tools for farming, including sickles, spades, and hoes. In addition, bronze bells, dotaku, mirrors, and swords have been found in many parts of Japan. These bronze items were probably used in ceremonies as symbols of power. As an example, a bronze mirror is the sacred object of worship at Ise Shrine. We call the period from 300 BC to 300 AD the Yayoi period. The name Yayoi is a place name in Tokyo. The first pottery made with new techniques was found there. The techniques for making this pottery probably came from Kyushu along with rice agriculture. 3. Formation of the First Kingdoms. Beginning in the Yayoi period, Jomon hunters and gatherers began to decline. More people settled in permanent communities and took up agriculture. The communities grew into small kingdoms called kuni. One of the most important of these was a kingdom known as Yamatai. The information we have about Yamatai is detailed but confusing. One of the best sources is the 3rd century History of the Wei dynasty. In the passage Gishi wa Jinden, it describes the land of Wa, which is now Japan. It mentions a large kingdom of 70,000 households. The kingdom, with a capital called Yamatai, was governed by a queen named Himiko. Yamatai had diplomatic relations with the Wei kingdom in China. Ironically, the exact location of Yamatai is not completely clear. It may have been in Kyushu, or it may have been in the Kinai region, also called Yamato. New research may determine the location in the future, but it is clear that there were other large and small kingdoms in the Yayoi period. Many of them had a hereditary leader. The early Yamato kings wanted to prove they inherited authority. They created oral myths to show this authority. They also began to build giant burial mounds, or tumuli, called kofun, to honor earlier kings. The earlier kings were usually a father or a brother. These mounds strengthened the new king's position. There are some 10,000 of these in Japan. The years from 300 AD to 710 AD are called the Kofun period, or tomb era. 4. Introduction of Buddhism. The Sui dynasty began unifying China in 589, followed by the Tang dynasty in 618. Suddenly, Chinese culture spread into Japan. Chinese painting, sculpture, poetry, and history had a powerful influence on the kings of Japan. The Japanese learned architectural styles from the continent and learned to write poetry in Chinese. One of the most important influences was the introduction of Buddhism in 538. Prince Shotoku is often referred to as the founder of Buddhism in Japan. He promoted Buddhism through the government and encouraged the building of temples. It is said that he ordered the construction of the famous Horyuji near Nara. Prince Shotoku issued a series of injunctions known as the 17-Article Constitution. They were based on Buddhism and Confucianism. These series of laws took power away from individual clans and put that power under the emperor. This was a major step toward building a system of political control in Western Japan. 5. Taika Reform. The Taika Reform of 646 changed land control and government structure. First, it required land boundaries, a population survey, and dividing land among families and individuals. The people who got land were then required to pay taxes on the land. Second, it adopted a Tang dynasty type of government, a legal system called Ritsuyo Seido. This established a system with officials selected by the emperor. Clan leaders gradually became government bureaucrats. Both parts of this reform made imperial control stronger. When Emperor Tenji died in 672, a struggle for power followed. It was called the Jinshin Disturbance. In it, Tenji's son and Tenji's younger brother Tenmu fought over who would become the next emperor. Tenmu won, and he began a major unification of the region. He established a capital city and provincial headquarters. These were administered by a common code of laws. This new system, based on models from the continent, would last for 5 centuries. Society grew more complex. It was necessary to develop laws for a central government ruled by the emperor. A new legal code called the Taiho Code was completed in 701. This new code put together penal law, Ritsu, and administrative law, Ryo, for the first time. Under the Ritsuyo system, the emperor had sovereign power. Central offices were linked with provincial headquarters. Common laws set punishments for people who broke the laws. An inner group of 300 to 500 elites controlled a region of about 5 million people. Chapter 2. Nara and Heian. 6. Building a capital at Nara. Yamato rulers moved their capitals often. It was partly an act of spiritual cleansing. It was partly because traditional construction rotted easily. But as the government bureaucracy grew, it was important to have people, equipment, food, and belongings in one place. Building a large new capital frequently became difficult. Yamato rulers began to want grand capitals like the glorious new Chinese dynasties built. They also wanted to build impressive Buddhist temples. As a result, the Empress Genmei decided to build a grand, more permanent capital. The capital was called Heijō-kyo, in present-day Nara. The capital remained there until 784, when it was moved to Nagaoka-kyo. However, the whole period between 710 and 794 is called the Nara period. Part of the Nara period is called the Tempyo period, 729 to 749. During this time, the government sent diplomatic missions to Tang, China. It also sent students to learn about Chinese institutions, Buddhism, and culture. Painters, jewelers, carpenters, and craftsmen were sent to China to polish their skills. Thousands of the artworks they brought back are preserved in the Shosoin. The emperors began building Buddhist temples in and outside their capital. They wanted to use Buddhism to protect against illness and natural disasters. In 743, Emperor Shomu ordered the creation of a huge statue of Birushana, the central Buddha of the Kegon Sutra. The gilded bronze Daibutsu was completed in 752. It was the largest, most splendid ever produced in Japan and was housed inside the Todaiji Temple. Todaiji became the most important center of Buddhist learning in the country. 7. Kojiki, Nihon Shoki, and Manyoshu. Another import was the Chinese writing system. The Japanese did not give up their language. Instead, they used Chinese characters in various imaginative ways. The characters were used with both Chinese and Japanese readings. Characters were also written in new simplified forms as hiragana and katakana. Each character represented one syllable. These three forms are still in use today. One of the first uses of writing was to compile the history of Japan. The first history, the Kojiki, Record of Ancient Matters, was completed in 712. Another chronicle, the Nihon Shoki, Chronicle of Japan, which was written in Chinese, was completed in 720. Perhaps the greatest early literary work was a collection of famous poems. The poetic anthology Manyoshu, Collection of 10,000 Leaves, was completed about 759. Before the Manyoshu, there was a strong interest in Chinese verse. But this anthology created a new interest in the waka form of poetry. Waka are written with 31 syllables. The pattern of waka is 5-7-5-7-7. This form of poetry had special rules, imagery, and subjects. This anthology became a major classic in Japanese poetry. It had a headnote for each poem. The headnote gave the name of the poet and told the place and situation of the poem. 8. Moving the capital to Heian-kyo. Emperor Kanmu took the throne in 781. He wanted to show his power by creating a new capital at Nagaoka-kyo. It was an unlucky location. There were frequent floods, and he experienced frightening omens. He abandoned the place and selected a new site, which he named Heian-kyo, now Kyoto. It would be the capital from 794 until 1868. The power of the Buddhist priests in Nara was a problem for the emperors. Kanmu decided that he would not bring those Buddhist leaders to his new capital. Instead, he and his son Saga promoted new Buddhist teachings. Kanmu supported the Tendai and Shingon traditions. He found two earnest followers of Buddhism, sent them to China to study, and built places for them to teach when they returned to Japan. One was Saicho, Dengyo Daishi, who established a comprehensive center for Buddhist studies on Mount Hiei in 788. That temple complex, called Enryakuji, became a center for Tendai teachings and the Lotus Sutra. Mount Hiei became one of the most important Buddhist centers in the country. The other was Kukai, Kobo Daishi, who established a base for teaching esoteric Buddhism on Mount Koya. In the capital city, the Toji Temple became an even more important base. Tendai and Shingon Buddhism continued to be influential forms of Buddhism for centuries. 9. Fujiwara politics. The imperial family tried to rule Japan by government offices and by military campaigns. However, other royal families began to share power in the government. The most important family outside of the imperial family was the Fujiwara family. The Fujiwara managed to gain more influence than other families and become close to the imperial house. They became regents, seisho, and influenced imperial rule. Fujiwara regency politics, Sekkan Seiji, used family ties. Daughters of the Fujiwara family married members of the imperial family. Future emperors were raised by Fujiwara mothers. These emperors were influenced by Fujiwara grandfathers and uncles. In a later development, several emperors retired and ruled as cloistered emperors, Insei. 3 emperors, Shirakawa, Toba, and Go-Shirakawa, ruled this way. They were retired, but they became more powerful than the actual emperor and more powerful than the Fujiwara. For this period, the imperial house regained control of the government. The Fujiwara leaders lost a large part of their influence. 10. Kokinshu, Makura no Soshi, and Genji Monogatari. Members of the Heian court cultivated the waka form of poetry. The poet Ki no Tsurayuki and 3 others gathered an anthology called the Kokinshu in 905. It is an imperial anthology of some of the best poetry of the period. Tsurayuki also created a new literary form in the Heian period. The Manyoshu, for example, was just a collection of poems. But Tsurayuki used poems in a diary or narrative form. He wrote a diary during a trip in 935 and placed poems in it. This Tosa Nikki was a new way of using poems in telling a story. Several decades later, a court lady composed Kagero Nikki. This autobiography included both poems and letters. Another court lady named Seisho Nagon added observations and commentary to poems and created her own masterpiece of Heian literature. Makura no Soshi, the Pillow Book, is an entertaining description of life in the imperial court. The second type of literature created during the Heian period was the tale Monogatari. This new type described the personal interests and activities of the people in the imperial court. The first was Eiga Monogatari, a kind of biography of Fujiwara no Michinaga. The best of this type is Genji Monogatari, the tale of Genji. The author, Murasaki Shikibu, created the story of fictional Prince Genji and his world. It describes the elegant court life of the capital city with great skill.